Hello, culinary wine students. Kirsten Fox. Today, Thursday, for our weekly Culinary Wine Questions webinar. Welcome if this is your first time. We're happy to have you. And if you're watching this on replay, awesome. Whenever you can get to this is great. So, Kirsten Fox, I'm the CEO of Culinary Wine Institute. I also am the headmistress of Fox School of Wine, which is a public wine school here in Utah. And I write for the Huffington Post with all sorts of silly, funny stories about wine and life. And let's see, I'm a rep for Southern Wine and Spirits, which is a brokerage here in Utah. So I talk about wine to restaurants all over the state. So welcome. Today, as I mentioned in my chat box, I am drinking a Malbec, and just happened to be what was open in my refrigerator. Oh, hey, you might be surprised that Malbec, a red, is kept in the refrigerator. So when you have opened a red and you haven't finished the bottle, you always want to cap it, cork it, do anything you can to minimize the oxygen getting into the wine, and then refrigerate it. Because wine is just like fruit. The cooler it is, the slower the process of aging. So this is called Trapiche. It's a big brand, Trapiche. This is their Oak Cask Malbec 2013. And what I love about Malbec is it's basically to me like a cheap man's Cabernet or a cheap woman's Cabernet. It's got a lot of the same fruits, those dark berry fruits, but Malbec itself actually comes out a lot less tannic than a Cabernet does. So it is really easy to drink it, much faster. So, well, I don't mean faster down the bottle. I mean, it's much more quick to drink in a nice sipping style in wine because the tannic levels are lower than in a straight out Cabernet. So this is a 2013. A 2013 Cab would be pretty darn tannic, which means your mouth is just astringent, extremely dry. So I'm gonna have a sip of this. Just a nice berry forward, presentable wine, especially great with beef because those Argentinians love their beef. So today we are talking about what does the word dry mean. For this little excitement, I am going to start a video. Now, you will be able to hear the video very well, but the images that you see might be a little bit stilted because the technology I use for my webinars isn't the most expensive, so it's not super, super high quality, but at least listen to the audio and keep up with the visuals as they come because it is a very valuable video. So here we go.
Back to the grapes. All they do to make wine is squeeze the grape so the skin breaks. They crush the pulp and drain out the juice, which comes out of both white and red grapes as a colorless liquid. As an aside, one of the key differences in whether a wine will be white or red is if the juice is allowed to sit on the skins of the grapes. The red skins act like little dye packets and they dye the juice. Little yeast organisms are naturally present on all of our fruit, vegetables, and edible products, which means that they are on the skins of grapes. Since the skin of the grape is broken, the yeast can start eating the sugar in the juice. Yeast eating sugar gives us two byproducts, carbon dioxide and alcohol. So over time, alcohol builds up in the juice. We've almost all accidentally made fruit wine at some point or another. In fact, I just noticed an OJ container at the back of my fridge that I hadn't touched in a while. I pulled it out and entertained my 8-year-old by trying to sit it on the counter. And it wouldn't because it was so filled with gas because the OJ inside had started to ferment. Since the carbon dioxide couldn't escape, it was trapped inside, causing the buildup of gas. If we had tasted it, it would have been fizzy, and we would have actually tasted the alcohol in our tongues. Now, focusing on the fermenting juice, if you stop the yeast from eating all the sugar, you will have sweetness or residual sugar left in the wine, and this is called off-dry. If you let the yeast eat all the sugar in the juice, there is no sweetness left, and that's called dry. Now, just a moment here. Why do we call a wet product like wine dry? There really is no clear path to the origin of the use of the word. The most common theory is that back in the 1500s, when the French began to bottle wines, they began using the word sec, meaning dry, to talk about wines that dried out your mouth, made you pucker up, versus wines that had residual sugar in them. Whether the wine is sweet or totally dry, it is all basically grape juice that has sat in a refrigerator for a long time. It just turns out that in the fermenting, the flavors of a specific type of grape create other amazing flavors and aromas, and somehow we humans became fascinated with the effect.
So that was the video. So dry means no sweetness in the wine. And off dry means there's a little bit of sweetness left in the wine into sweet, which is actually a sweet wine or quite a bit of sugar left in the wine. So when I hear people talk about dry, the word dry, it is often, I think, the most common misuse of the word dry is when people are trying to talk about tannin, that grippy feeling in your mouth that is caused by big molecules in red wine that steeps into the juice from the skins and the seeds and the stems and that as it sits, like we saw early in that little video, where the red grapes will actually dye the juice in the with the tannin and the color out of the skin. But dry, people, because this wine, this Malbec, has tannin in it, it dries out my mouth. And so people, when they're trying to ask for wine, they might say, I'd like a really dry wine. I like dry wines. And then if you bring them a wine that might be dry, and let's say it is a super fruit forward Syrah, but it's dry, they might say, well, I said I wanted it dry. This is really fruity. Well, actually, fruit has nothing to do with the word dry. Dry has to do with the amount of sweetness in the wine. So if a wine is dry, it doesn't have sweetness. Nothing to do with whether it dries your mouth out, even though that might be where the saying came from, because actually when wine started to be made, most wine was sweet. So there's all sorts of different question as to where it came from. But when someone is asking for a dry wine at your table, the most important thing to ask is, do you like wine that has a lot of tannin in it? Do you like a really big, full, rich red? Or are you asking for a wine that might not necessarily have all that full-bodied flavor in your mouth and something a little simpler? Because when you start getting them talking about what they like, you can figure out if they want fruit or whether they really do mean dry. Because I've had people actually say, I would like a really dry wine. But I don't like fruit, and I like a little sweetness. It's just all over the place. So a simple question to ask is, what kind of wine have you liked before? What do you have at your house? Perhaps, what do you like to order when you go out to eat? If they're a little bit reticent to tell you, maybe start asking if they want a little bit of sweetness in their wine. Do they like that? Or would you prefer something that doesn't have any sweetness? If we use the word sweetness instead of the word dry, it starts to help people understand what they're actually asking for. So dry means no sweetness. So when we're talking about food pairings at a table and someone's asking what to pair with what, most table wines, which means most wines that we drink in the United States that are commonly seen on menus. Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Malbec, Cabernet, Syrah, Zinfandel. I mean, there are so many different varietals. Most of those are all dry. The difference, what you have to make sure you never, ever, ever suggest is a dry wine with a sweet something. So the most common example I use that everyone gets is, I'm sure you've been at a wedding. You got a piece of wedding cake in your mouth and they pass around the dry champagne to do the toast with. And you take a sip after you've had a bite of the sweet champagne, excuse me, the sweet cake, and the champagne tastes like you're drinking acid. It's super, super, super sour. So what you always want to make sure is that if you're pairing something with a sweet food, you need the wine to have some kind of sweetness in it. In fact, if it's a dessert wine, you want the dessert wine to be sweeter than the dessert itself. But so, for example, if you are serving a something with teriyaki, and teriyaki can be very sweet, you might go for a wine that has this very, very strong fruit forward, like a Zinfandel. We talked about that last week, where it's fruit forward, and it's going to help complement the sweetness of the food with the berry rich flavor of the wine itself. You would not want to go with a super like a Malbec tends to be pretty tannic and pretty strong, and you don't necessarily want to put that with a food that might have a little bit of sugar in it. That's going to make the wine taste sour. It's going to make it taste just sour and awful. Okay, so that's really the only pairing to stay away from in regards to dry wines. I do have a special offer for you today since you're on the webinar, and it is if you haven't gotten a chance to get my book, I have a special offer for you, and it is going to be it's the right side of your page, according to what I see on my screen here. So you will get half off my book, and I'll pay for shipping, and I'll sign it for you. So it's usually about $20 plus shipping on, Amazon, and I'll give it to you for $10 today, and I'll pay all this postage and tax and send it off to you with a signature. So you're welcome to use that. If you want to think about it, go ahead and click send this to me. It will open it up in a new window, and then you can still keep the webinar open without having to worry about getting a credit card and that. So I am going to go ahead and head back to what we are going to do next week. Let me get to that. So our topic next week is, what kind of wine goes with soup? It is a really crazy medium for food. You've got noodles in some cases, veggies, meats. Sometimes it's just a broth. So how do you help your guests, and how do you figure out a complementary wine to suggest for that soup? So that is what we will be taking a look at next week. And I am going to go to the chat room, and if anybody has any questions, let me know, because I've got a little bit of a delay here. It's about a 30-second delay. Happy to answer any questions about dry or sweet or tannic. So just remember that really the key pieces here is dry has nothing to do with whether it dries your mouth out. Dry has to do with whether it is sweet or not. So if it's dry, it means it's not sweet. And if it's something called off dry, it means there is some residual sugar in the wine. So thank you for joining me today. Cheers, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.